She was beaten for refusing a forced marriage, until a poor woodcutter stepped forward and did something no one else dared to do. On the day of her wedding, when the priest asked her to say, "I do," Nandala pressed her lips shut and shook her head. Her refusal fell like a stone in the silence of the crowd, but instead of respecting her courage, her fiancé turned into a monster. He raised his hands and struck her, again and again, in front of the whole village. His fists fell, like stones, each blow echoing louder than the last. The crowd gasped, yet no one moved. Her father lowered his head and sharpened his blade as if she was already dead to him. Her mother stared at the ground, lips trembling but sealed. And the neighbors? They stood frozen, whispering but unwilling to help. It seemed like her world would end right there until a man no one expected stepped forward. It was Omari, the quiet woodcutter, the man who lived alone at the edge of the forest. He was known for silence, for solitude, not for defiance. Yet that day, he walked calmly through the sea of still bodies, his steps heavy and unshaken. He looked the abuser straight in the eye and said words that made the whole village tremble. "She's coming with me." He did not shout, but his voice carried like thunder rolling over the hills. And in that instant, no one dared to stop. Him, what gave such a man, who barely spoke, who owned nothing but his axe, the courage to face an entire village? And what became of the young woman he chose to protect? This is the story of how one quiet act of bravery would change two destinies forever, while also ripping open a secret that Nandala's family had buried for years. For them, silence was always heavier than blows, sharper than knives, and harder to heal than bruises. The morning after the wedding that never was, Nandala awoke with the taste of dried blood on her tongue. Her eyes were swollen shut from the beating, her cheekbones tender, but it was her heart that ached most deeply. She had slept outside, curled on the porch, like a stray animal in her own family's house. She wanted the world to end in the darkness of the night. But dawn had come anyway. Inside, the house moved as though nothing had happened. Her mother boiled porridge in the clay pot, the spoon clinking against the rim, but her eyes never once lifted to her daughter. Her hands never reached to touch her face or soothe her pain. Her father, Kafala, sat under the cashew tree with his machete, scraping it against a stone. When Nandala stepped closer, desperate for a word, a glance, a sign that she still belonged, he spoke without looking at her. "You brought shame. Now deal with it." Those words were heavier than the beating. Flesh could heal, but rejection from the one who gave you life pierced deeper than any wound. In her chest, Nandala felt something shatter. For a fleeting moment, doubt whispered in her mind. Maybe she was wrong to resist. Maybe she should have married Imbui, even without love, even with fear. He had land, wealth, and the whole village's approval. Perhaps security for her parents was worth more than her freedom, worth more than her voice, worth more than the small, fragile piece of her heart she wanted to protect. But when she touched her bruised skin, she realized the cost. She would lose herself forever. Her mother, Zula, washed the bloodied cloths, scrubbing and wringing, them with fury, as though she could wring out the memory itself. She did not offer palm oil for the wounds, did not boil the sacred leaves to soothe pain as she once did when Nandala was a child. Back then, when Nandala fell from the mango tree, her mother had run to her side with care. Now, she pretended not to see. In her silence, she seemed to say, "You spat on the plate of survival." And it became clear her mother's love had limits, the neighbors whispered. Some called her ungrateful, rebellious, cursed. Others felt pity, but kept quiet, fearing Kafala's anger. In this village, tradition was iron, stronger than blood. A woman who defied it became a shadow, alive, but already buried. When Nandala tried to rest again on the porch. Her mother nudged her away with her foot. "Not here," she muttered. "You've brought enough shame. Go with that man from the woods. He defended you, now you are his burden." The words cut deeper than any whip. She was not thrown out with shouting, but with contempt. A slow, cold rejection that gnawed at the soul until it felt empty. And so, with no bundle of clothes, no blessing, no kiss goodbye, Nandala walked away from the only home she had ever known. The bamboo gate creaked shut behind her like a final verdict. At the edge of the forest, Omari was waiting. He said nothing. He only extended his rough, calloused hand, the same hand that split logs and carried bundles heavier than most men could lift. His silence was an invitation, not a demand. Nandala hesitated, her heart still clinging to hope. Maybe her mother would call her name. Maybe her father's heart would soften. But the village stayed silent. Only the gate creaked. That night, she lay on the packed dirt floor of Omari's hut. He gave her a blanket, placed a mat in the corner, and pointed without words. The fire burned in the stove, casting shadows on the clay walls, filling the space with the warm scent of wood. And for the first time, though broken and cast out, she felt something like relief. Here was silence too, but it was different. Not silence of rejection, but silence of safety. Not condemnation, but care. In her parents' house, silence had been cruel. In Omari's hut, silence was gentle. He gave her no speeches, no promises, no grand gestures, just a roof that did not ask her to trade her soul for shelter, and a piece of cassava bread that expected nothing in return. It was enough for hope, faint but alive, to stir in her chest again, because unlike the family who abandoned her, Omari did not need to break her spirit to prove her worth. And though she was still bruised in body and shattered in soul, beside him she began to sense something she thought she had lost forever. Dignity. The sun rose shyly behind the mountains as Nandala opened her eyes for the first time in that clay and wood hut. Light filtered through the gaps in the thatched roof, drawing stripes on the packed dirt floor, as if the day itself was feeling its way into the space before entering fully. She woke with a start, her body still aching, her soul hesitant, unsure if she was dreaming or if it had all really happened. The refusal, the beating, the expulsion, the stranger who saved her with a single sentence. Dot in the corner of the room, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and dry leaves. She could hear Omar's footsteps outside. The woodcutter was already up. As always, the axe struck the trunk with steady rhythm, like a rough prayer to time itself. The scent of freshly chopped wood mixed with the simple aroma of cassava cooking over the clay stove. Still wrapped in the pain of all she had lost, Nandala felt a pang in her chest. Not fear, but something unfamiliar. It was the first time in a long while she had woken up without shouting, without demands, without having to explain herself. Omari didn't come inside early. He left a plate of cassava and a cup of water on the small table beside her mat, and went back to work. He didn't say eat, didn't ask if she was all right. He just left it there. And it was that respectful silence that began to stir something in. And because it wasn't the silence of punishment, like in her parents' house, nor of judgment, like in the village, it was a silence full of space where she could breathe, think, exist without being pushed into roles she never chose. On the second day, she woke up earlier, still weak, still without strength, but with her dignity slowly awakening. She washed her face with cold water from a clay pot, straightened her mat, folded the blanket, and looked at the hut with new eyes. The walls, though rough, were solid. The floor was clean. There were neatly stacked bowls, roots hanging from the ceiling to dry, and in one corner, carefully kept inside a gourd, a small wooden figure, an ancestral symbol of protection. She didn't ask what it meant, but by looking at it, she knew there was faith in that place. Not the kind used as a weapon or emotional blackmail, but the kind that lives in gestures in the land. In the silence of a man who wakes early and shares what little he has without seeking praise, Nandala sat in front of the plate left for her. She looked at the piece of cassava. It was simple, but there was something in the gesture, a quiet tenderness, a care without demands. She ate slowly, and in the taste of that root, she felt the flavor of a new beginning. Omari came in only at the end of the day when the sky was already painted orange and the birds stirred noisily in the high branches. He carried more firewood, a bundle of leaves and a new hammock woven by his own hands. He simply said, "It'll be more comfortable than the mat," and he stretched the hammock between two posts in the wall. Then he took off his worn sandals, washed, his hands in the basin, and sat on the floor near the fire. He didn't ask questions, didn't bring up her past. He just lit the fire with calm gestures and began cooking the evening porridge. Nandala, not knowing why, felt her eyes burn. That man, the one everyone called rough, was the first in many years who didn't try to control her, who didn't throw her, pain in her face. He didn't want anything. And maybe because of that, she began to want to stay. Not out of duty, but because there was respect here. A word that to her had long been buried under the weight of tradition and others' expectations. That then on the third day, when Omari went out to chop wood, Nandela took the straw broom hanging by the door and began to sweep the porch. No one asked, no one ordered, but she did it. She did it like someone who decides for the first time not to run from her own existence. She swept like someone saying, "I'm here and this place is mine now, too." It wasn't a declaration. It was a gesture. And in stories like Nandala's, gestures always said more than words. When Omari returned, he found the porch clean, the bowls organized, and the hammock carefully laid out. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered on her a second longer, a second that said, "I saw," and she understood. For the first time since life had pulled the ground from beneath her feet, she was seen. Not as a bride, not as a daughter, not as a burden, but as a woman, whole, wounded, but worthy. But that night, as she lay down, Nandala looked up at the thatched roof and thought about the word home. She never really knew what it meant, but there, lying in that makeshift hammock with the scent of burning wood and Omari's silence just outside, she felt something that came very close to peace. And even without knowing what tomorrow would bring, she fell asleep with a lighter heart. Because sometimes all a soul needs to start healing is a place where love doesn't come with conditions, but with space to breathe. The village had a habit of forgetting quickly. Or at least that's what they liked to pretend. After Nandala was taken by Omari, the subjects seemed to vanish from every conversation circle as if it had never happened. But the silence there wasn't peace. It was fear. Fear of scandal, of shame, of change. Fear that other daughters might see the example. And also refused the futures drawn for them through silent deals between fathers and suitors with coins in their pockets. So when the topic resurfaced, it came as whispers, sideways glances, and fingers pointed in secret. But Imboy didn't forget. The man who once boasted about being the perfect match, the ideal catch, now carried a wound that wouldn't heal, a wounded ego, humiliated in front of the entire village, rejected by a woman who, according to him, had no choice. Imboy disappeared for weeks. Some said he had gone to the city seeking advice from his influential uncle. Others said he was plotting something, chewing on his rage like someone sharpening a dagger with his tongue. It was on a stifling afternoon with thunder threatening in the distance that he returned. He arrived riding a skinny donkey, but his eyes were those of a man mounted on a throne of thorns. He stopped in the middle of the village, jumped down violently, and shouted for all to hear, "She's my fiancée. She was promised. She was given, and I'm going to get her back, even if I have to drag her from the woods." His voice echoed between the mud houses and the mango trees. The women gathered their children, the men pretended to be busy, no one confronted him, and Bowie was thinner, but hate made him look larger. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for approval. He found none. What once looked like courage now wire of poorly hidden shame. Still, he went and climbed the path into the woods, crossed over rocks, waded through the stream, heading straight to Omri's hut. He knew where it was. Everyone did. They just pretended not to. Dot at the hut. Omari was stacking bundles of firewood, as always. Nandala beside him was sifting flour. She lived there as if learning to breathe again. Her hair tied back simply, her feet still marked by the earth, but her face had begun to lose the constant trace of pain. She didn't smile much yet, but she no longer cried as often. When she heard Mbui's footsteps approaching, her body froze, not from physical fear, but from the memory of what it felt like to be someone's possession. And she was no longer anyone's. Mbui burst into there like someone invading territory, his eyes blazing. "Nan Dollar!" he shouted. "You're coming back with me! Enough of this nonsense! This shame has gone on long enough!" Omari didn't run. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked up, wiped his hands on a coarse rag, and walked to the center of the yard. He stopped in front of Imui without saying a word. No weapons, no witnesses, only eyes, and with those eyes, he spoke. Moi, who came blazing with fury, hesitated. Omri's gaze was firm, silent, deep, like the village well. A look that didn't need to shout to be feared. There it was no threat, but something more powerful. Conviction. Conviction that he would not let this happen again. Not here, not anywhere. The silence lasted only seconds, but it weighed like hours. Mbui stepped forward. Omari didn't move. He just kept looking. A look that said, "Try." And in that moment, something cracked inside. It wasn't fear of being hurt. It was shame, because for the first time, someone stood in his way without fear, without hate, without saying a word. And Bui spat on the ground, scoffed, and stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice had already lost its strength. It was just the echo of a power slipping through his fingers. He mounted the donkey and rode off. Defeated not by violence, but by a quiet resolve that can't be bought with dowies or promises. Nandola had watched everything from the doorway. Her hands still trembled. But there was something new in her eyes. She was no longer the girl who bowed to her father's orders, no longer the young woman who accepted the fate imposed by the village. She was now a woman who understood the value of the silence that protects and the power of a gesture made at the right moment. That night, Omar's hut had no celebration, no words of victory, but the fire burned higher. And for the first time since she had arrived, Nandela slept without nightmares. Because knowing someone stands tall for you, even when the whole world told them to stay quiet, is a kind of love that isn't asked for. It's simply recognized. The village was small, but its tongue was long. After Imui's public humiliation, no one dared confront Omar directly, but their eyes said plenty, and their mouths, even in apparent silence, spoke even more. At the cassava markets, in the lines at the well, between straw porches, came questions that weren't really questions. They were accusations disguised as concern. "She's living alone with him," murmured the women with cloths tied at their waists. "No blessing, no ceremony. Is that right?" Some of the elders furrowed their brows in rehearsed sorrow, as if the real scandal hadn't been the beating, but the fact that a woman had found shelter without the approval of men or the church. "She lay with him without a blessing," they whispered, as if the woodcutter had stolen her honor. But what no one could deny was that Nandala had changed. She walked through the village with her chin high, eyes steady, and a lightness in her step. She wore simple clothes, yes, but there was a kind of beauty in her that didn't come from vanity, but from dignity reclaimed, And for many that was more disturbing than any scandal, because to see a woman they once called ruined now walk with, her head held high, was like staring into a mirror, reflecting their own swallowed cowardice. The younger girls looked at her with quiet admiration, because there before them all stood a woman who dared to say no, who was beaten, cast aside, and didn't break. A woman who chose to stay where she was respected, even if it was in a clay hut. Even if it was beside a man the village couldn't categorize, and to many that was dangerous, because it awakened desires they had been taught to silence. The men, in turn, avoided speaking of Omri in public. They knew the woodcutter was no longer just a quiet man from the woods. Not that he'd changed, but his act of defending Nandala had transformed how he was seen. Before he was just a nobody. Now he was a man who carried a kind of quiet justice. Some envied him, others feared him, but no one called him strange anymore. The strongest comment, however, came from the mouth of the least expected. One Sunday morning during the village meeting where elders gathered to talk tradition, a fragile voice rose up. It was Mujima, the village's blind elder, blind in her eyes but not in her soul. Seated on her wooden stool, hair braided in silver strands, hands calloused by time, she silenced the murmurs with the kind of authority only the truly lived carry. "I hear people speak of the girl as if she's lost," she said, voice low but sharp. "But I ask, isn't the man who protects a fallen woman asking for nothing in return? More of a man than the one who knocked her down?" The silence that followed hit like a stone dropped in a river. It stirred everything because Majama didn't speak to be heard. When she spoke, even the wind paused to listen. Her words drifted through the village like smoke from a fire. There was no putting them out. And somehow, after that, the tone of the whispers began to shift. There was less venom in the stares, less certainty in the criticisms. What emerged now was a mix of quiet respect and discomfort. Because when wisdom speaks, even malice must fall silent for a moment. Nandala heard the talk. Not all of it, but enough. She knew of the murmurs, the hidden jokes, the judgments disguised as piety. But unlike what they expected, she didn't hide. She kept going to the market, helping with the harvests, tending to the hut with steady hands and a heart that grew lighter each day because she knew what the village still couldn't admit. It isn't the altar that sanctifies love, it's respect. And Omari, as always, said nothing. But every day he left firewood stacked in the corner, swept the hut's entrance, and warmed water before sunrise so she could wash her face in comfort. That was the kind of blessing the village didn't understand. The blessing of care, the blessing of silence that shelters, the blessing of not needing to prove anything to anyone. In the hut, there were no rings, no loud promises, but there was something older than any ritual, the daily choice to stay. And that was what the neighbors didn't know how to label. Because deep down, what truly scandalized them wasn't the lack of ceremony. It was the fact that even without one, a home had been built. Simple, real, steady, like the trees Omari cut, and as deep as the eyes of Nandala, when at the end of the day she looked at the woodcutter and knew for the first time she was exactly where she was meant to be. It was a heavy late afternoon, and the sky hung low with thick clouds, the kind that threaten rain but might not deliver. Nandala, used to the light chores around the hut, had insisted on going with Omari to collect firewood. He hesitated, as he always did with change, but then nodded quietly. This wasn't just about carrying wood. It was about claiming space, and she knew it. They climbed the trail in silence, as they always did when crossing the forest. The woods were dense there, with high branches interlaced above, damp leaves underfoot, and the scent of wet earth that seemed to speak directly to the lungs. Omri walked ahead, clearing the path with his machete, tuned into the sounds of the forest, like a watchful guardian. Nandala, a few steps behind, took it all in. It was the first time she entered the forest without fear, and maybe for the first time, with a heart free from urgency, while Amari chopped larger logs, she wandered a bit to gather kindling. Her hands, already calloused from daily work, picked up dry twigs with care. With each piece of wood she collected, it felt like she was slowly burying the past that weighed her down. It was as if the forest, silent, alive, was teaching her that everything broken could be used to ignite something new. Then, between two thick roots of an old fig tree, her fingers touched something that wasn't wood or earth. She gently dug it out and uncovered a small, aged wooden box tied with a braided straw cord. Her heart quickened. Finding something like this in the middle of the forest was anything but normal. She called out to Amari, but her voice came out low as if the moment itself asked for secrecy. She sat on a moss-covered stone and carefully opened the box. Inside, wrapped in embroidered cloths with simple designs, flowers, leaves, little stars were baby clothes, a crocheted sweater, tiny leather sandals, a cap embroidered with the name Imani, meaning faith. All clean, all folded with care, like keepsakes no one ever forgets. But there was more. A necklace made of seeds, and a piece of paper that read in trembling but firm handwriting. If you ever arrive, you'll know you were awaited. Nandala froze. Her throat tightened. Her eyes welled up before she could stop it. This wasn't some forgotten treasure. It was a shrine of longing, an unspoken, waiting, assolant cry buried deep in the forest. She understood. No one needed to say it, that the box belonged to Omari, and that inside it lived a dream that had never come true. Hidden from the village, perhaps, even from himself. She didn't ask anything when Omari appeared and saw the box in her hands. There was no need. The woodcutter stopped, breathed deeply, and sat beside her. He didn't take the box from her. He didn't look away. He only said, voice, tight with emotion, "It was meant to be, but life said no," and then fell silent. Nan didn't press. She didn't ask for details. But sitting beside this man who never needed to explain himself, she felt that his silence spoke more than 1,000 stories. She imagined a woman he had once loved, a child that never came, a hope undone by life's cruelty. She thought about the pain of preparing everything and receiving nothing, about the kind of faith that keeps a box like that, not out of attachment, but out of love that refused to die. She held the box as if trying to give it back to time, then closed it carefully, tied the cord, and handed it to him. Omar took it with trembling hands, and without saying a word, placed it back between the fig tree's roots exactly where it had been. Nandela stood watching him, and in that scene there was more intimacy than in any embrace. On the way home, neither of them spoke, but their steps matched in rhythm, and Omari's eyes, though wet, carried a kind of release, as if a weight too heavy for one had finally been shared. Nandala, for her part, now understood something she didn't yet have words for. That love is not measured only by what is lived together, but also by the pain quietly welcomed and held. That night, sitting by the fire, Nandala did something she had never done. She took the maize pestle and began to hum an old song, one her grandmother used toesing when the world felt like it was falling apart. A melody about hope, about roots, about the faith that grows from the earth. Omari listened without interrupting. He just listened. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. A small smile, brief but real. In the hut that night, something in the air had changed. It wasn't joy, but it was light, the gentle kind of light that rises when two wounds recognize each other and decide together not to become walls, but bridges. The morning after the hidden box was found, the day dawned clearer than usual. The mist that usually rested over the thatched rooftops lifted early. The air felt lighter, the forest's silence, less dense, and even the village rooster crowed in softer tones. Nandala woke with a feeling that was hard to name, something between gratitude and courage. She had dreamed of a child running through the trees, smiling at her, and when she opened her eyes, the dream didn't fade. It lingered on her skin. Or was, already in the yard, sharpening his axe. His eyes focused, arms marked by the labor of a man who lives by the cut and weight of wood. She watched him for a moment before stepping outside. Something inside her had matured the night before. It wasn't just empathy for what she'd seen in that box. It was something deeper, a recognition. Omari, despite all his silence and roughness, was made of a quiet tenderness. And now she knew with bare feet on the damp earth, Nandala walked to him, stopped by his side and said in a voice firm but soft, "Will you teach me how to chop wood?" Omari looked up, surprised. He had expected many things from her, that she might want to return to the village, that she'd leave once she felt healed, or perhaps that she'd prefer never to walk the forest paths again. But not this. She, with her delicate hands and slender frame, asking to learn the trade that was at the core of him. "It's heavy work," he said, as if testing the resolve in her voice. "I don't want to cut like you," she replied. "I want to learn the way, the rhythm, the sound the wood makes when it gives in." It was more than a request. It was a declaration. Nandela didn't just want to take up space in the hut. She wanted to share in his life. And for that, he needed to understand the soul of what he did each day. Not to imitate him, but to walk beside him. As an equal, Omari took a deep breath and handed her a smaller axe, one used for thinner branches. He didn't smile, but there was a light in his eyes she had never seen before. They walked together to the edge of the clearing where dry logs lay waiting, and there, beneath a sun that warmed without burning, he began to teach. He showed her the angle of the cut, the stance of the feet, the quiet pause between one strike and the next. He didn't say much, but each instruction came with a watchful gaze like someone passing on an old secret. Nandala tried, failed, laughed at herself. The blade struck crooked at first, slipped other times, but she didn't quit. Omari, patient, corrected. Her with a gesture, a light touch on her shoulder, a nod of the head. It was as if that morning had been written long ago when the sun was high and sweat ran down her temples. Nandala stopped, rested the axe on the ground, and looked at him seriously. Omari approached, thinking she'd asked to rest. But what shone in her eyes wasn't fatigue. It was certainty. "Omari," she said, her voice both steady and trembling. "If you want, I can stay here." But this time, by choice, it was as if time stopped between them. The trees seemed to hold their breath. The birds went quiet. He looked at her for a few seconds, as if trying to translate the words he'd just heard. Not because he didn't understand them, but because he had never expected to hear them, never imagined that someone, and especially she, would say it first. "I don't need a promise," she continued, "or a ceremony. I need truth, and here I found that." Omri didn't answer right away. He rubbed his short beard, looked down at the ground as if searching for steadiness, then looked back at her, and in that look was something he had never let show before: vulnerability. "Then stay," he said, "but for you, not for me." And Nandala knew she would stay. Not out of gratitude, not from lack of options. She would stay because she chose to. Because this man, with all his pain stored in boxes buried in the woods, was the first to let her be exactly who she was. And she, with all her scars hidden behind silence, was the first to truly see him. They walked home in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a new one. A silence full of understanding, presence, and something that only forms when two lonelinesses stop avoiding each other. When they arrived, Nandala lit the fire, cooked the meal, and left a plate for him on the porch. Omari washed his hands. sat beside her, and for the first time they ate together, sharing the same dish like two people who had decided to share a future. That night, they didn't speak of tomorrow because they knew that here, love didn't need promises. It just needed consistency, and that they had already begun to build. Time passed the way it always does in villages, in silence, between harvests, rains, and crackling fires. There was no calendar, but the days marked their presence in sprouting seeds, falling leaves, and the deepening wrinkles on the elders' faces at Omari's hut. Life unfolded in simplicity and care. Nandala tended to the garden, the clothes, the fire, and the little details that, to the eyes of love, become treasures. Omri followed the rhythm of a woodcutter, chopping, stacking, delivering. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was a life of dignity. In the village, time also took care of quieting the scandal. The gossip faded, the stares grew more neutral, and the whispers gave way to a kind of cautious respect. Everyone knew something different was happening in that hut. Even without celebration, without rings, without public blessing, there was a home there, and that was undeniable. It was on a late afternoon under a pink sky that the letter arrived. The boy who brought it ran along the trail in a rush. Thin legs coated in dust, chest heaving, he stopped in front of the hut and handed the crumpled envelope to Nandela, who was washing roots outside. It was old paper folded many times with her name written by hand. The boy said nothing. He handed it over and left. Nandala held the letter with wet fingers. Her heart raced. The handwriting, stiff, unmistakable, was her father's kaffa. Firm, dry strokes, just like his words. She stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Omari, sawing wood at the far end of the yard, noticed the silence and the expression on her face, but didn't approach. He simply watched from a distance the way he always did when he sensed her soul was about to open an old door. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper and read, "Daughter, if this letter finds you, it means time has passed. The groom is gone. It's over. The shame you caused is forgotten. Your mother misses you. I do too. We want you back. The house is open. Everything can go back to normal." Signed, Kafala. Nandala didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just took a deep breath like someone swallowing a piece of the past still bitter on the tongue. She read it again slowly. Dry words. No apology, no mention of the beating. No acknowledgement of the moment he looked away when she was kicked across the yard. Just it's over. As if pain had an expiration date. As if the shame had ever been hers. She entered the hut, holding the letter tightly, and walked over to the wood-burning stove, where the fire still glowed under the pots. She stared at the paper for one more second, and without hesitation dropped it into the flames. The paper twisted, curled, and turned to ash in seconds, and as it burned, Nandala whispered, her voice low, but weighted with meaning. It wasn't time. That passed. It was me. Omari heard her from outside. He said nothing, but he paused what he was doing. Like someone who understands when a chapter has closed, he didn't need to read the letter. All he had to do was look into her eyes. And what he saw there wasn't anger nor sadness. It was freedom. That letter wasn't an invitation. It was an attempt to regain control, to pretend that everything could be forgotten without ever being healed. But Nandela no longer belonged to that place. She was no longer the obedient daughter, the rejected bride, the village disgrace. She was a woman, and finally the owner of herself. That night, the fire in the hut burned brighter. Omari made sweet porridge, a rare treat, and they ate together in silence. But there was something in the air, as if the hut were quietly celebrating the strength of a choice that refuses to yield. When they finished, Nandela set her bowl aside and said, "Thank you for never asking me to go back." Omari looked at her. He answered with a gesture, a steady gaze, a peace that only the wholehearted can offer. He knew that real love doesn't bind, it holds, and sometimes that's all it takes to heal what even time doesn't dare touch. There was no invitation, no announcement in the square, no drums played, no applause rehearsed. But on that day, as the sun cut through the clouds like a gentle blade of light, the whole village seemed to know something sacred was about to happen. Woke early as usual. She swept the hut's porch, lit the fire, washed her face with cold water from the clay basin. But there was something different in the way she folded the headscarf, in how she braided her hair, in the reverent silence with which she gazed at the packed earth beneath her feet. It was an ordinary day, and yet it carried the solemnity of miracles. She wore her firewood clothes, the same as every day. A worn cotton skirt, a simple blouse without decoration, no flowers in her hair, no necklace around her neck, but her spine stood straight, her gaze clear, her steps firm like someone walking proudly through their own story. It was the clothing she wore to live, and it was with it that she chose to join Omari. He, too, had risen early, as he always did. He sharpened his axe, swept the yard, and when he looked at Nandela, he understood without a single word. He wore his usual shirt, the one he used for market days, clean pressed with the heat from the pot lid, face freshly shaven, hair smoothed back with wet hands. Nothing more was needed. They walked together slowly in silence to the highest part of the hill where Majama lived, the blind elder woman whom all respected. She waited for them in her straw chair, a white cloth over her shoulders, her face turned toward the wind. Though she couldn't see, she knew who was coming. She felt it in their steps, the scent of earth, the silence wrapped around them. There, before her, nothing needed proving. "You've come?" she asked, her voice worn but solemn. "We have," Nandela replied. Omari said nothing, but his entire being said yes. Dot Mama asked them to come closer. She stretched out her wrinkled hands and placed one on each of their heads. Her palms rested there with the lightness of ancestral blessings, as if life itself, through her, acknowledged the path they had walked. "I bring no long words," the old woman said. "I bring what is alive." And then, without naming saints, without reciting verses, without repeating formulas, she blessed them with wisdom, born of pain and time. "May your love not need to be seen but felt. May pain never become a weapon. May silence be a bridge, and may the ground you walk together never split beneath you." Nothing more was said. Nandela and Omari looked at each other. They exchanged no rings. They did not kiss before a crowd. But in that moment, with their eyes locked and feet rooted in the land that had sheltered them, they vowed more than many who wear white and exchange golden vows. They vowed presence. They vowed courage. They vowed to continue the village, though distant, new. Some climbed the hill discreetly. They stayed at a distance, as if afraid to break the spell. They saw the two of them standing before the elder, the light of sunset tracing the edges of their bodies. And for the first time in a long time, there was no judgment. There was silence, a silence full of respect. Back home, Nandela didn't change her clothes. She cooked intham. Amare stacked wood beside her. They sat together on the porch, shared a plate of maize, drank from the same pot-off water. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because now everything they lived bore the mark of a choice. They didn't sign papers. There were no witnesses with pens in hand. But there were trees, there was wind, there was earth, and there was faith. Not the faith taught in classrooms or from pulpits, but the kind that rises when two souls after so many falls find in each other a place to rest. That night, lying in the hammock Omari had made, they listened to the sounds of the forest like a lullaby, and they fell asleep like that, without empty promises, without grand ceremonies, but with a love as real as the warmth of the body lying beside you. That was their wedding, and no one could undo it. Time passed unhurriedly in that little hut. The seasons came like familiar visitors, each bringing its own lessons. The garden grew bigger each year, the chickens scratched the earth with more confidence, and the firewood kept being stacked with the same steady patience. Nandala and Omari grew old together like two trees that even without showy flowers withstand every storm. And for those who live off the land, that's more beautiful than any harvest. They never had children, at least not by blood, but life gave them other kinds of inheritance. Peace in the mornings, respect in the words they shared, and a tenderness found in the smallest of gestures, like tea made in advance, cloth washed at the right time, orsolence held gently when the soul needed shelter. The hut, once simple and secluded, had become what the most attentive called a land of welcome. Women came seeking advice. Men sat under the mango tree to hear Omri speak about the right wood for a stove or the signs of harvest time. No one called, them leaders. But everyone knew that in that quiet corner of the world lived a strength that never shouted. It simply remained. It was on an afternoon under a heavy sky with the wind carrying the scent of an oncoming storm that a knock came, and it sounded different. It was weak, trembling, almost a cry for help. Disguised as a knock, Nanala opened the door and found a young woman, thin and dust-covered, eyes wide, arms bruised. She didn't need to ask what had happened. That kind of pain Nan Dollar could recognize, from far away. It was the same look she once carried years ago. When Omari had taken her from the dirty yard after the beating, the silence, the expulsion, the young woman said no name. She only whispered, "They told me a woman lives here who was saved." Nan looked into her eyes and saw not just pain, but a spark that had survived. The girl trembled. She bore the marks of violence, not just on her skin, but in her posture, in the hesitation to enter, in the silent plea not to be sent away. And so Nandela answered with the strength only lived experience can offer. "A woman lives here who learned how to save." Omari appeared at the door, cloth in hand. He saw the girl, saw her state, and asked nothing. He only nodded as if to say, "You can come in." The girl was welcomed just as Nandala had been. No interrogation, no demands, no promises. She slept for 3 days straight. The first day, she simply ate and laid down. The second, she cried herself to sleep. On the third, she helped Nan sweep the yard. The cycle was beginning again, but this time, it was Nandala who held the hand. She was the one offering the meal, the hammock, the tea, the quiet presence. With time, the young woman shared her story. A forced marriage. A father who traded her to a violent man in exchange for sacks of corn, the beatings, the threats, the escape under the light of a full moon, the long road until she heard from the lips of a vendor that there was a place where. A woman lived who had said no and survived. N.A. listened without interruption. She only held her hands tight because she knew pain when recognized begins to dissolve. In the months that followed, the girl learned to plant, to prune dead branches, to boil herbs that healed not just the body, but the spirit. She learned that starting over is possible, not like in fairy tales, but like someone remaking a path with short steps over stones, under sun and rain. Dot. Then one evening, much like the one when she had arrived, the girl said, "One day, I want to do for someone what you did for me." Omari, sitting on the porch, replied with his usual calm. "Then we are at peace." The girl smiled, and for the first time these that had only reflected fear now held something different. It was hope. It was life. Nandala embraced her. And in that embrace, generations of women gathered, wounded, silenced, and still alive. From the outside, the hut hadn't changed. But inside, there was now one more heart learning how to beat with dignity. And that was everything. Life in that hut among sturdy trees and packed earth carried on as it always had. Simple, steady, filled with the scent of firewood and the sounds of birds at dawn. But now there was something more. Not luxury, not miracle presence. The kind of presence only those who choose to live truthfully can sustain through the years. The village, which once turned its face away, now turned its whole body when Nandala walked by. There were no more cruel whispers, no gossip hidden behind cloths. There was respect. There was reverent silence. Young women looked either like one looks at an ancient tree full of marks, deeply rooted but still standing. Some even came closer, asking for advice. Others came in secret, bringing a little flower or a question to tangled in shame. What if I said Noto Nandala answered with her eyes? She didn't need speeches. Her response lived in the way she rose from the hammock, in the way she broke cornbread with her hands, in how she welcomed without asking where the pain had come from. Because she knew healing doesn't begin with words. It begins in the gaze that doesn't judge. Omar, in turn, became a reference among the men, not for the strength of his arms, but for the strength of his silence. He was called to help with builds, to settle land disputes, to bless crops, and even, without calling himself a leader, he became one. The once rough man was now seen as an example in all this, without ever leaving the hut or seeking applause, because true authority doesn't impose itself. It's earned through presence, through consistency, through integrity. Nandala's aging father, Kafala, fell ill years later, a slow sickness, draining his strength day by day. The news came through a neighbor. Omari heard it first. He didn't comment. He simply let the information rest. Nda Allah learned of it, gazed at the horizon for a long time, and by dusk she had prepared a basket filled with medicinal leaves and dried roots. She handed it to the same neighbor with only one sentence. Tell him it won't hurt as much. She didn't return to the house where she was born. Felt no need to. But she carried no bitterness either. Because over time, she understood forgiveness isn't a return. It's a release. And caring, even from afar, is still a way of loving. When love no longer fits in the past, but still fits in dignity. As time passed, the hut became a refuge. Other women came, some stayed for days, others for months. Some in silence, others sobbing loudly. All were welcomed. There was never a sign, no announcement in the village, but those who needed it knew. Because true hope doesn't need advertising. It spreads like the scent of fresh bread on a hungry morning. Nandala and Omara grew old together like those who grow stronger with time. Their hands wrinkled, their backs bent, but their ease stayed steady. They didn't become legends. They became roots deep in the earth, visible to few, but sustaining the life of many. And perhaps that is what true love is. Not the one that shouts at celebrations, but the one that stays after the celebrations are over. The love that needs no witnesses because it becomes its own witness of what's possible when two souls choose not just to be together, but to be shelter for one another. At the end of their lives, there was no gold saved up, no titles. But there was a story, and that story echoed through the village like an old proverb. The woman who was beaten for saying no taught others that no can save, and the woodcutter, the man no one used to see, became a symbol of what a man could be. Not because he raised his voice, but because he lowered his axe and offered his hand. Because in the end, the deepest strength doesn't come from domination. It comes from choice. The choice to stay. The choice to care. The choice to love without hurting. And that was the choice that changed everything. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our